looking for is for the BAC to review the scope of work and determine, based upon the information provided, if you find it reasonable to assume that the work can be completed outlined within the budget. In this case, the budget is 1.8 billion. Regarding the BAC's conclusions after review, there are a couple of options here. The sort of perfect scenario, the one that staff, of course, would prefer, is that after review, the BAC says, yes, everything looks great. It appears 1.8 million is sufficient to complete the scope as outlined. That said, if there is one or more scope that you feel you don't have enough information, or you're concerned that maybe the cost estimates or budgets are too aggressive, you can note that concern and recommend that the board may wish to request more information from staff. And so it's not your burden, it's really staff's burden. You're just making your recommendation. And to be clear, you're not expected to act as a de facto cost estimator or an auditor. PPS has those functions. That is not what is expected of this group. So any questions about the kind of the charge and expectations? Okay, we will go into it. Some quick overview. As you may recall, PPS began holding public meetings to plan for the next general obligation bond in early 2025. And over the following months, both the scope and the budgets changed and evolved considerably. In May, this group met to review the bond scope of work and cost estimates at that time, which totaled about 2.5 billion. But by the following month, the total had increased to nearly 3 billion. And at that time, the board directed staff to shift the target date for a referral from November of 24 to May of 25. And the board paused further planning discussions at that time. We, staff, anticipated that the scope of that 3 billion would likely change pretty significantly. Therefore, we put our discussions on hold as well until there was more direction from leadership. The board restarted again in October bond planning when the board constituted a new subcommittee that was called the School Facilities Improvement Oversight Committee. And they have met 3 times, once in October, once in November, and the last time on December 3rd. This committee established the bond planning goals shown here for targeting a total principal amount between 1.5 and 1.8 billion. Planning for an 8-year bond cycle, and I'll explain that in a little bit. That's probably not intuitive to everyone. The district began a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar capital improvement program back when the first bond passed in 2012, the first one in almost 2 decades. And that plan was based upon the assumption that the district would continue to go out for capital bonds roughly every 4 years. For a number of reasons that I won't enumerate here, that plan has evolved into an 8-year assumed bond cycle. So in other words, the district anticipates that we'll approve the bond in 25 and the next bond will be roughly 8 years later. And this plan allows for reoccurring scopes like curriculum adoptions and student device refreshes to plan for that period of time and to expend their funds and then assume or plan for funds again in an 8-year time period. The last 2 are retaining the existing tax rate, which is $2.50 per thousand of assessed value, and then continue to plan for a ballot in May of next year. So here's the option, the current proposed option. It hits almost all of those planning parameters, except the total does exceed that 1.8 billion by a little less than 2%. And we'll walk through each one of these scopes unless there's any initial questions. Hearing none. So we'll start at the top. The proposed option includes 190 million to address critical facility improvements. As we staff have reviewed extensively with the board, PPS's physical facility needs are really big and really broad. This slide is really just a simple summary that kind of highlights the overall needs, and some of the notable kind of talking points are the district's overall facility condition, when you take in the whole portfolio, is rated as poor. When we did a facility condition assessment several years ago, 62 of the 94 sites were rated as either poor or critical. Our total deferred maintenance deficiencies from the FCA, there's over 15,000 of them that were noted, and they exceed $1 billion to address just those deficiencies in that assessment. Additionally, we have annual capital renewal estimates that are well over $100 million just to maintain. And then we also have a substantial list of improvements that are deficiencies that the district would like to complete around ADA, seismic improvements, security improvements, et cetera. So the upshot is $190 million is a substantial sum, but relatively small amount compared to the total district need. So given the large and diverse facility needs and acknowledging we have a fairly long-term planning horizon, we expect it'll take somewhere between 8 and 10 years to complete all the work in the $1.8 billion. And recognizing that our data is not perfect, it's essential that we build flexibility into this approach, which allows us to adopt over the next roughly 8 or 10 years. So what this is a sample or an example of how that 190 million might be spent, when we're at the end of the program. It's not a plan of how we're going to spend the money. What we anticipate is we will address the highest needs. We will spread the funds amongst a number of categories of work because those are all important categories. They all impact learning. They all support the learning environment. But essentially, this scope is a spend up. We are going to spend this amount of money at a minimum, and we're going to spend it on these facility improvement categories, but not identifying exactly which one or what sites they would be. Kara, you have your hand up.
Greg might have actually beat me, so Greg can go first.
So Dan, as I listen to the conversation, you say you have $100 million a year annually is needed to maintain what you have. And this 190 is going to go towards your 1 billion. Do you have the 100 million to maintain the school facilities? Period. Is that what you budget each year for school maintenance, or?
That's a good question. We do not have that. That's 100 million roughly in capital that we need. And so we do have some capital outside of the bond funds, but it's pretty small unless it's something that is restricted, like a grant, for example, that will go to a specific project or category project. So in all, we just don't have enough to maintain, considering the total portfolio we have now, which can change over time. It's also fair to note that the modernization work, like the high schools that we do, they also take care of a chunk of these as well. Those are large schools, so they factor in as well.
But will this not then imply that 1 billion is just going to get larger over the next 8 years? I mean, you're doing some stuff, but you're not meeting your needs. So the 1 billion, if I were to come back 8 years from now, ignoring the time value of money, that 1 billion would be even higher. Is that right?
From a total portfolio standpoint, yes, certainly certain facilities will improve, but overall, we're not able to maintain.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, that's kind of in line with my question. So like if you have a rating of poor and $1 billion makes it better or good, like does 190 million move you from poor in that index to like less poor or fair? Or is it always, sorry, Greg's laughing at me. I don't know the ranking system.
It's a good question. And one thing, like caveat, like the data around the FCI, it's pretty high level data. So we don't try to be too precise about it. That said, we do high level estimates. And we looked at, Heidi can speak to specifics because she's the one who did the work. So I'll just speak for Heidi, hopefully not incorrectly. If we were looking just at the deficiencies and taking out things like modernizations and other work, and said that we wanted to move the district from a poor category rating into a fair rating, I think it was fair, right, Heidi? Yeah. That would take roughly $700 million over 10 years. So that doesn't take into account capital renewal. That is on top of that. So again, the upshot is the needs are very big and they're broad, and these are tough decisions about where to allocate funds between deferred maintenance, improvements, our educational improvements, and our modernization.
So I guess in conjunction with that, do you feel like, and I know this is just an example, but like as planning moves forward, it would be highest and best use of funding to move the whole portfolio towards a fair kind of rating?
I think the best way to answer that question is there are differing opinions on where to prioritize the capital funding. When the district began what we call its current program, the 2012 bond, there was a very specific intention then that the district would modernize all of the high schools. That would be their first sort of task, was modernize the high school. The rationale, multiple, but one of the primary rationale was every kid, mostly at PPS, is going to go through a high school. So the sooner we can modernize them, we know that we're touching basically all of the students at some point in time in their career once we get those modernized. And then once those are done, to then look and focus on other work. It's an oversimplification, but that is one of the rationales, and we hear a lot of preference for that approach. Jonathan?
Thanks, Dan. And is my microphone working now? Can you all?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. I am curious if you also have a way of sorting the data that's by building rather than by systems, as you're talking about deferred maintenance. So I just wonder if there's, if there's a certain 20% of the buildings that represent, say, 60% of the deferred maintenance. Is that information that's available to you all?
We are able to sort it by site. It's a good question about that. Is the 80-20 rule applied to? I don't know that offhand. I don't know if Heidi, if you know that offhand, who looks at the data quite a bit, but if you don't, that's fine. But that is something that we can carve out.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that super briefly. Answer is always yes. As we dug into this data really more intensively the last couple of years to see what we could pull apart, we determined that there's no top 10, there's no 80-20. Sure. That doesn't mean that there isn't some proportionality. I would just say that we haven't gotten that far in our analysis. We do, when we look at that $1 billion, and we are refreshing this data on an ongoing basis. So we're going to see an update to our facility condition assessment data set within the next year, because ODE is very graciously now, they're doing this for districts. So we're moving into a new era with this data as well. So I'd say more to come. But there's more.
I'll be brief. I mean, this is probably way out of line for somebody who sits on an advisory committee, but what's behind the question is, I used to live in Sabin. I could see Sabin out my window. And I think there were 5 elementary schools within a mile of my house. And so I just think about when I lived there, like the amount of challenge you all have in doing all this planning and dealing with all this deferred maintenance, when at some level we just have so many 80-year-old buildings all over the place. And I'm obviously not saying anything you haven't thought about, so I'm going to go back on it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Greg?
Yeah, just to follow up, make sure I understand. The $1 billion or plus of deferred maintenance, is that after we do the 3 high schools? Or does that number go down after we do the 3 high schools and the 190 million?
I see Heidi's up. Go for it, Heidi.
Yeah, we backed out schools slated for modernization from that $1 billion.
Okay. Thank you.
So we'll move on to the next topic, but just kind of like the high point for or note for kind of the charge of the BAC is this is a scope, not like we're about to get in a scope that's got a lot more detail, that's project specific, where this is more of it's a spend up. So spend all those dollars. We don't have designs for most of this work, and we won't until we prioritize them and start actually looking to execute that work. The next topic is more scope specific. And this is one that's changed a lot. In fact, the scope and estimates on this changed even last week. But overall, big picture, PPS lacks the athletic infrastructure to support all schools and all programs, even all the high schools. Unlike suburban districts, most of PPS's high schools, in particular high schools, but are on very small properties. We can't fit all the athletics onto those sites, so students need to be dispersed, and we don't have those dispersed facilities to accommodate all of our athletic programming. So the proposed bond includes $79 million to include specific improvements at a number of sites noted here, including we have budget to replace tracks and synthetic fields over the next decade. We have that included. In the materials are cost estimates for each one of these specific projects. Heidi is going to walk through a couple of examples, not all of them, but she's going to walk through a couple of examples in a minute. We're happy to answer questions about any specific site or project. But for framing, I want to walk through the primary variables that go into our cost estimates, similar to our high schools, those variables that go in there, but a little bit different. So if I would walk through it, it might just help get some framing and maybe answer some questions on the front end. Similar to our modernization work, we start with our hard costs. Usually with our modernizations, we have a third-party professional cost estimator. In this case, we don't have designs or we don't have independent cost estimates for this work. Therefore, for the most part, the hard costs come from recently completed PPS projects, similar projects. We've done tracks, we've done fields, we've done hitting facilities recently. So we're using that data as average unit cost for the most part. And then we add on our soft costs. Similarly, we're looking at projects where we've done this type of work, these field projects, and we see the soft cost markup at about 18%. So we've applied 18% in all or almost all cases. If there is an exception, it's noted, and Heidi can talk to that. And then FF&E is another adder. Our projects that have facilities like a hitting facility, batting cage, we also include that we're going to equip that facility as well. So we have an FF&E markup. Again, because we don't have designs, we have a number of contingencies that we apply. So I thought I'd just talk through the rationale of those contingencies, and then if there's any questions, we can answer those. The first is a scope or design contingency. As we know, where we get our hard cost unit data from. And so those are averages. The point of the scope and design contingency is for uniqueness of the site. So we add 10%, and that's to account for potential site design considerations, such as we might need additional lighting on a site, or a site might have unique grading that would require, more grading, more stairs, more pathways, something like that. So that's what that 10% is there to cover. We have jurisdictional requirements with our hard costs. Some of our hard cost unit data is coming from components of larger projects. For example, Lincoln High School, we did a synthetic track and field there, so we use that data. But as a standalone project, which many of these are, they will be required to go through entitlements, land use, building permits, so they could get conditions of approval added to them, and therefore we carry a small contingency to account for jurisdictional requirements. And then the project contingency, because there's a lot of earthwork here, it's hard to know what's underground. We include 50% for all these projects as well. And then I think lastly, and I'll stop talking for a minute, is our cost escalation. We escalate all of our projects. We have yet to build a specific program schedule for all of the bond work. So we don't know exactly when these projects are going to hit. We think all of it's going to be completed in roughly 10 years. So from a cost escalation standpoint, we effectively treated these as one, and we provided 5 years of escalation, roughly to the midpoint for all of them. We used 4% per year, assuming that that's going to be the midpoint for completing all the work. And we acknowledge that this means overestimating escalation for some projects and underestimating escalation for other individual projects. But as a whole, we think that's a reasonable approach to buffering against cost escalation. And with that, I will turn it over to Heidi. She was going to walk through a couple of examples. I don't know, Heidi, if you want me to pull up the PDF document. Or also, is there questions first on the variables?
That's where I wanted to start. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Questions about contingencies or how we're deriving our hard costs as the baseline to start?
not a question, but you did answer when I was reading the material, Dan. I thought you're going to do all these projects in the 5th year. And then, of course, as you've explained it now, that makes sense. And it also makes sense that you've got some history. I think is Grant the one that'd be closest to the kind of projects? Because we did that one separate. We did it next door. It wasn't part of their modernization. So it seemed that that would be the closest one to some of these, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. That project came with it, entitlements and all the process needs connected with that. There's still grant projects to come. You see those on the list. And it does feed into one of my, I love a good footnote. And so we footnote a little bit in the detail in the packet about jurisdictional requirements and kind of what that's really about. Not unfamiliar to people in this group, I don't think. So what I thought, are there any further questions about hard costs, what those contingencies might contain? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to jump in just to describe scope. Dan, if you'd be willing to pull up the PDF and share out, I'd just like to look at that main scope sheet with the contingencies for West Sylvan. So in the long range facility plan, we talk about athletic hubs, and we also talk about middle school field improvements. And West Sylvan is one of those middle school fields that we have pulled off the pile and said, if we're going to look at how to be the most effective in all, high school clusters across the district with our field space and our improvement dollars, West Sylvan's a great one. So it's an unusual jurisdiction. I just want to flag that for everybody. It's actually City of Beaverton. It's not City of Portland. So it brings with it its own special kind of entitlement requirements. We will be starting from scratch, even though we've done some process on that site in the past. So this is a baseline assumption. We would do at any middle school that we improve a synthetic turf multi-use field. So we want to be as flexible as possible in terms of overall scheduling and also simultaneous activities that we can reasonably support on a given field. And to get the most scheduling use out of a field, we need to have lights. So that is truly the baseline kind of overall scope that we could apply to a site. In the case of West Sylvan, because that's one that we've looked at before, we know that those contingencies are reasonable looking at that. So I think that some of the other use assumptions, just to clarify why the scope looks like it does, we could do it without lights. That's always a question. Lights are expensive and it triggers some things in entitlements. However, that would reduce our scheduling efficacy for about half the year to about a third of what we could normally get after school if we had lights on a field. Any questions about West Sylvan or anything I missed, Dan? No? Okay, let's then go to a more complicated one, which is the Jackson Middle School Hub, or excuse me, Jackson Athletic Hub, which is a middle school. So the Jackson Hub is unique. The athletic hubs were also addressed in the long range facility plan. The idea is to bolster use of the properties we already have. We want to make sure that we fit out all of the potential field space so that it could be used for student activity scheduling. That's the primary focus. Jackson's an unusual site. It was actually originally built as a high school, so it's a little bigger. It was really fun to look at this one. It's also a really unusual site. So some of the special things that come with it, we looked at how to redevelop the site, leaving it in its configuration, but get the most field use out of it. It has some very noticeable grade complexity. It's got some soils conditions complexities, and it's just overall as a scale, we can get a lot of fields on that site, but we knew it would take careful planning. So we actually initiated some work we obtained approvals for a conditional use master plan, which gives us a 10-year development timeline. We obtained those approvals toward the beginning of this calendar year. And what this scope looks at is what if we did phase 1 of that approved master plan. So that's where some of the ding ding dings come in. So there's under the jurisdictional requirements have got a 30% allowance in there. It is an extremely unusual site. And because we've already been through our work with the city, we know that phase one would include all of the non-conforming upgrades that the city would require. So that includes a lot of street tree planting, additional drainage upgrades works, some corrections to soil conditions and so on. Things that are a little outside the typical scope of just getting people to a site and having the field be playable. So the hard costs show the multi-use field and the lights, which we've already talked about. We are including a hitting facility that is right now it's looking at basically it's just shy of a code threshold. So it's a 2-lane hitting facility with some storage. And then there are, because of the site area, there's some additional potential turf field area that we could include in phase one of that work. Are there any questions about Jackson? Greg?
Yeah, the jurisdictional requirements. I mean, what is it? $3 million, $3.8 million. That doesn't, you said there were some drainage things, which are kind of interesting. Are there street improvements that have to be made? There are.
We have right away. We have frontage improvements on 2 long edges of the site, 2 very different parts of the neighborhood. And one of them, there's a connection to safe routes to school work that PBOT is looking at on also both of those frontages.
You don't have to go off-site though. They're not requiring any off-site improvements.
Correct. It's all contained within, just contained. Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember. I should have looked up the numbers. I apologize before logging in, but we're planting hundreds of trees. That's one of the things we needed to increase the tree canopy by a significant margin. We also have some, we're going to have some soil export and import, and we're going to have to do some wetlands. It's a low functioning, but still categorized as wetlands mitigation. It's part of the work.
But the site you're doing it on was all included in the original Jackson High School, or did you buy some more? It was all included when they did the high school.
Correct.
Which was in the 60s, wasn't it?
60s. It was 1962. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think Norm, you went there, didn't you? I think Norm went. Okay.
Yeah, I went to high school there, and my kids went to middle school there.
Oh, so you have a lot of experience on that site.
Yeah. In fact, they did some right-of-way improvements, or not right-of-way, but street improvements in the last year or two, where they put in bike lanes and pedestrian stuff, but it was nothing too heavy duty.
So I also find interesting, the lights are the same for every project.
They are. So we're right sizing the lighting system just to provide field illumination.
Okay.
But yeah, we worked with Musco a few years ago, and they're typically the provider for this type of field lighting. They're really efficient. It's a great lighting system. Generally speaking, on the market today, you can get away with somewhere between 7 and maybe 9 light poles to light a large multi-use field. In the work with the city, we are only lighting that main multi-use field. That's what was approved in the plan. There is a little bit of incidental lighting that we get out of those to illuminate pedestrian paths, but it's not beyond that.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add one note. I think you mentioned it, Heidi, that the Jackson or land uses for the full site. This is just for the phase one, and all of our jurisdictional requirements we're assuming are in phase one. So that phase two will be, from that standpoint, significantly cheaper. So we're happy if there's any other of the athletic projects that caught anyone's eye, we're happy to walk through those. Otherwise, we will move on to our next scope of work. Okay, we'll move on. There we go. Okay. So physical education, I'm actually going to ask for Heidi's help again on this one. This is another scope that doesn't have a lot of specificity, so I'll give a little background. Heidi can, of course, give more background and more detail. But the Oregon Department of Education made some changes in recent years, or some of those changes have become applicable. It requires all of our middle schools to provide a certain number of PE minutes per year. And this requirement has caused for the district to make improvements to a number of schools that just didn't have enough facilities based upon the enrollment of students. And so I don't know offhand, Heidi probably does, how many schools that we have made physical changes to in the previous years. But what it's come down to is we've got 6 schools that have unique site restrictions and are going to require some unique solutions. What we've been able to do elsewhere, we haven't been able to do here. Those solutions, we haven't determined what they are yet, and they haven't been designed yet. So, but we expect that we're going to need some capital resources. So this is a bit of a plug number at $10 million to address 6 schools, 1.6 million, based upon the work that we've done, that Heidi's done, that we've coordinated with our physical education team. We think that is an achievable number. We haven't seen too many projects go over like $1.5 million. And so there is some risk here, but we think it's pretty manageable. Heidi, you want to add any detail?
Had to get to that mute button. Yeah, just to clarify, so the work that we've done, there's been a significant number of, it's basically we're looking across the board at what we could do to increase the number of teaching stations. Yeah, and I'm going to bug Joanna in a second here, increase the number of PE stations, teaching stations across the district. So just generally speaking, we have done detailed site walks, and we've taken a look at what's needed for the instruction of different types of physical education that all kind of feed into the whole program. And a lot of what we have done is looked for opportunity space use adjustments to bring equipment into the schools that's used for this instruction. There are still a number of spaces that remain not very safe for, potentially like impact movement, that kind of thing. But we would need to make some structural adjustments to an interior space, or possibly add covered exterior space or some other kind of adjustments. So that's what this 6 schools looks like. You can see from the list, we've got, among others, we've got MLC located at Cooch campus in Northwest Portland. And we have Ockley Green, which is, got some pretty intensive right-of-way abutments and constrained site area, even though it looks like it should be easy. Once you start taking a look at it, it really isn't. It's a very constrained site. So, and there's some unique interior conditions at all of these buildings that limit what we can do without hiring an engineer and going through a permitted project to alter an interior space. Joanna, could you mention maybe a little bit more about the work that we've done to date and in expanding the PE teaching stations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I think you and Dan covered a lot there. So hi, everyone. I'm Joanna Tobin, Senior Director in the Office of Teaching and Learning. And Jenny Withicum, Assistant Director of Health and PE, is on my team. And we've been working together really closely with Heidi and team to really identify the scope needed. I want to back up just super briefly and mention what Division 22s are. So Division 22s are the assurances where every district has to go in front of the board every year and say, hey, we are in compliance with what ODE is requiring of us. And so uniquely so, 6th through 8th grade PE is actually a law requiring 3/4 of PE every year. This has had a really long runway and gone through a few iterations. And to Heidi's question, we were able to implement movement labs in a lot of our middle schools in K-8 to add an additional instructional space. So the reason for the need for the additional instructional space is when you have increased PE minutes, of course, you're teaching more PE, you're having more classes, and our principals are being very creative with where and how they're, using spaces and designing their schedules. But as Dan and Heidi mentioned, there are these remaining schools, as you see on the slide, 6 schools that just have very unique physical constraints that don't allow for full implementation of physical education. So it's really a combo of either adding a covered area, doing some unique flooring work, and I'd say it's mostly the additional covered area for most of these. But that's the reason for it is because of this law. It's no longer you ought to meet these minutes, which has been for a long time. ODE is now requiring us to fully implement by the fall of 2025. They're working with us. We've met with them regularly and even recently. And they appreciate, that we're going this direction and know that it's going to take a bit of time for these 6 remaining schools. So that's a little bit of the why and a little bit more, just a bit more. Back to you, Dan and Heidi.
Thank you, Joanna. Any questions on the PD?
I don't have a question. I'll just comment based on what you told us we're supposed to do today, Dan. I don't know if 10 million's enough or not enough, right? But I have no reason to think it's not enough based on what you folks have told us and the amount of work you've done, and based on what you think in the past. And certainly 1.6 million for these 6 schools, and then removing from contingency if it costs a little more. I'm willing to accept what you're telling us, that this ought to do the job for you. I don't know how the rest feel, but.
Okay, thank you. We're going to stick with Joanna for a moment. Our next category is curriculum. This team will, of course, know that curriculum was added is a part of the 2020 bond scope. It's also a part of the 2025 bond scope. With a total amount of $56 million, which averages to that $7 million annually. And again, this is where that 8-year planning bond cycle comes into play. So I'll just go ahead and let Joanna provide an overview.
Great, thank you. I also want to introduce and recognize Marcus Wafield on my team. You've heard him speak and share before, and appreciate all of his hard work on this. The number you saw before was kind of an all-in and many more years, and really what you're seeing in front of you today is 8 years, $7 million each year for a total of $56 million. And what our superintendent and governance team have really leaned in on a concept that a bond ought not to be the sole funding source for curriculum. And so with that, we really have looked at what's required, again, per the Division 22s, what is ODE requiring of us? How can we make our pennies stretch? How can we also utilize title funds, other funds, and hopefully eventually create a runway for curriculum to be within our general fund budget. This is a challenge all districts face, and one that we're really being thoughtful and creative about. And so what this number does is it provides, as I mentioned, $7 million annually for 8 years for curriculum adoption specifically. And what we had to do with the schedule, which when I say schedule, it's the adoption schedule. So every year, the Oregon Department of Education requires a curriculum area to be adopted. We currently are doing, as an example, a K-12 health adoption. We're also wrapping up a 9-12 science adoption. Science was last year for ODE, but they allow for a 2-year postponement to still be in compliance 2 years after each content area. And so what our new schedule does is it names, we're going to need to stretch out adoptions over 2 years. So the example of next year would be social studies. So that would be stretched out over 2 years, either K-5 or 6-12. We haven't determined that yet going first, because it's out of our reach to do all K-12 within 1 year within this dollar amount, and it still allows us to accomplish what is needed within that kind of creative postponement allowance. Again, that other bullet point there, that this is not intended to be the sole funding source moving forward. And it does also require some immediate reductions, and also does get the job done. So that's a bit of an overview. I'm happy to share more if you'd like.
You said it's not the sole source. So what percentage do you think it is of what you need to meet the requirements?
Hopefully about 75.
Okay.
I think we're hopeful with a combination of Title II and Title IV dollars. Maybe we can get up to another 2 million there. That would be really helpful. We're also doing some things where we have a digital apps review every year, and we're still kind of coming out of the COVID days where we had more tools, and we're really looking critically at, do we have to have all of those tools? That's a very thoughtful process. It's hard to scale back, but some things aren't ultimately may not be necessary in the construct that we have moving forward. And so that's another area where we're hoping for some cost savings. Another piece is, just being really thoughtful of, what is ultimately going to be enough. And sometimes that's not adding a lot of bells and whistles, but it might be a text in a workbook. It might be just a digital version. It might not be a digital, a text, and a workbook, right? So, and these are things that districts do all around, just to really pinch pennies and be more mindful of costs.
And Joanna, are you saying that would be an additional 2 million a year of funding that comes from somewhere else? That's the 25%. Is that consistent? Because I remember there was like a lot of reporting challenges with curriculum for 2020 because there was money that was not bond specific. Does that align with like what you saw in the previous 4 years? Was it about 25%, or is that kind of aspirational that you can maybe get there?
I would say there's sort of two different things. I would say the overall dollar amount that we need to make to pay for curriculum adoptions and all of the other things that go into curriculum work, we're going to need more than 7 million. What you're referring to is there also are additional costs. I'll invite Marcus if you want to jump in at all. Please do. As with any adoption, there's people work, right? So there are teachers who are coming together to say, hey, this works great or this doesn't, or we go through this very thorough committee process. And so we do pay teachers, educators for their time with that. That's one cost. We also have a refresh cost for, more materials, as you may have had in your homes at some point in time, an extra textbook or, something lying around. These things do kind of run away. And so there is a bit of a refresh cost needed for any adoption. That's typical. So those are some of the additional costs that play into this. Uniquely so, we had ESSER dollars as well. Those are no longer here. And so that was another piece. And so yeah, I'll pause there and ask if Marcus, do you want to add anything to that question?
No, you pretty much hit it.
Okay.
Can you remind me, Joanna, this is 7 million annually, and maybe you said it and I didn't catch it. What did we do the last 5 years since the last bond? What was our annual expenditure?
Yeah, so we had around the same number, and we adopted essentially all core content areas in 4 years. So I'd say our run rate was closer to 13.5 million a year. And we also, now that we are aligning with ODE's schedule and not doing a sort of all at once approach, we're stretching that out more thoughtfully. So yes, the annual costs ought to be less moving forward. And there are additional costs. So just really super briefly, from an instructional standpoint, we talk about the core curriculum, which we call tier 1. That's sort of what everybody needs all the time. And then we have tiers 2 and 3, which is that additional support. Think of students with some lagging skills, needing a little extra dose of this or that. And so, uniquely so, the bond has supported, digital apps and a lot of that. And it will, we have to be just thoughtful of how can we do that a little bit differently. So I think I'm going beyond your question there. I can talk curriculum all day, so make me stop.
Dan, did we include an inflation factor in this 56 at 7 million a year? A book today, 8 years from now isn't gonna cost the same, I would think.
So our original methodology absolutely did account for that, and we had a bigger number. And so, where we're at is just saying we're going to need to be careful and frugal and thoughtful. And also, we do think we can get the job done.
Okay, that's important. Yeah, if your number was bigger, but you're confident you can get the job done for what you've got there, then that's what we would rely on as the committee, I guess, to go forward.
I think it's just really important to note and underscore, while we don't have, additional funds identified right in this moment, our superintendent governance team have been really clear that bond dollars are not, intended from here moving forward to be our sole source, right? So like I mentioned, Title II and Title IV, there's a great opportunity there. And it's just really, through that budgeting process, that annual budgeting process, being really thoughtful about where we can kind of expand beyond this funding source, which does a lot for us, and we definitely need it. And so it's just kind of it's really looking at a little bit of a different model. And the 2020 was in sort of uniquely so filling a really big hole in a couple decades of lagging curriculum adoptions.
Joanna, is it fair to sort of classify your comment there at the end is the approach is changed in that curriculum going forward is intended to be split funding, and so the $7 million a year is effectively an allocation from the bond to support that. The funds above and beyond that are intended to come from another source, and yes, there's program contingency and the bond to support some of that, but by and large, the bulk of that is not intended to come from the bond. It's intended to come from somewhere else. And I think that, letting the committee decide, but that might just be like a note that the committee might put in the recommendation of like, this is in essence, an annual allocation with the understanding that there are additional funds and those would support a need above and beyond the annual bond allocation.
Yeah, I think that's important, Dan, because particularly, again, we go back to what you said we're supposed to do today. We don't want to come away telling the board that, hey, the 56 million's enough when it's already been talked about that it's about 75% of what is actually needed and that the money's going to come from somewhere else, because that'll require the school board to make some budget decisions every year to meeting that delta that's there if they have to.
Correct. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Joanna. We're going to keep moving along with a couple more scopes. One in the memo, are people seeing the technology improvements? Okay, I'm figuring it out. I'm working on it. The memo has information about the scope of work, more than just this table you'll see for our technology improvements. There's a broad number of scopes there and significant funds. Unfortunately, our technology partners weren't able to make it today. There was an emergent issue that they needed to address.
Dan, I'm here.
Oh my gosh, Derek, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, I will turn it over to Derek.
I'm not able to see what you're sharing. Can everyone see? Okay. All right.
I'm just sharing the table, the high level table, Derek, that has the scopes and then years 1 through 4 and then years 5 through 8.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Brown. I'm the interim Chief Technology Officer for IT. And the table you have before you is very similar to Joanna's. It's years 1 through 4 and 5 through 8 of our refresh. The first line item is our bond modernization, our enterprise resource planning lift, and this is the replacement for PeopleSoft, a 25-year-old current system. This takes us to Oracle Cloud. We are well on our way and at legal now with review of the contract. Expect signatures at the beginning of the year and this going to the board in February. So it's an exciting time for this particular project. Student devices. For those of you that were here and remember pre-COVID and during COVID, we had devices in carts, and when it hit, we just, like Pez, had to give them out to all families and students as they needed them. We now are reeling that back in significantly, and part of this will be an asset management system that we currently don't have. We'll be acquiring it so that the new refresh of devices, staff and students, will be going asset tagged into this inventory system so that we will know beyond a shadow of a doubt how many devices are given to which schools. If schools are deciding to check them out, they will be assigned to the students. And then there's an accountability piece that we've put in this year with an AD directive for parents to sign this form, expecting the responsibility that we will pay for all repairs, but if the device is lost or broken beyond repair, families are responsible for the full replacement, because this is a nice to have. We don't require that students take home devices. It can live at school in a cart and be safe and used while the student needs to do their assignments and work. But if the student needs to take the device home, that's when the responsibility becomes the parents. So we're still working on that. That's going to take the better part of this year, because it's a change in culture, not only what we do with schools and buildings, but with families. So we've been doing that with schools since the end of last school year and throughout the school year. And that will continue this transformation and cultural change and how we take care of our devices in preparation for this refresh. The data center and classroom tech, this is technical debt. And I was here in 06 to 2010, and what we're replacing is some of the equipment from back then and part of the 2012 bond as well. So this is a refresh and paying for that technical debt. Cybersecurity, we did not get into details for a specific reason. We don't want to highlight and make public what we're buying to monitor and protect our network and environment. But this is for monitoring tools. It's not for people. It's for software, for dashboards, for us to have visibility into the network 24/7 with a partner. Thank goodness, because we can't do this work alone. And so that's what the cybersecurity is for multiple tools for us to protect our district, our network, and the environment. HVAC, it's for, and you might have heard the board members talking about this a couple of times. We don't want to put air conditioning in our IDFs and MDFs and have air conditioning in those spaces without air conditioning in the schools. We understand that, but at the same time, we're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into the school in a data closet so that the school can operate wirelessly, remotely, and mobilely. And so we have to protect that investment because, as you know, in the summertime, those buildings do heat up. Those data centers, those closets rather, get warmer than other parts of the building. And when it gets to triple digits, that's immediate degradation of that equipment. And the life cycle can go from 8 years to 6 to 5 to 4 very quickly with several days in those temperatures. And so that's about sustainability of the equipment. What questions do you have? Because I could, like Joanna, talk about this stuff all day.
Kara, I see you have your hand raised.
I do. I was curious, Derek, you said that and I know that the ERP planning was in the 2020 bond, so that makes sense why you're ready to sign a contract and execute that in February. But what if the bond doesn't pass? Like, how would that, because we won't vote on this until May, correct? So I guess my question is the timing. Is there like a cart before the horse situation on the ERP implementation?
That's a fantastic question. So, as you know, we have had Mi Young with us as our interim CFO, and there's been some, I'll call it gap funds or bridge funds that we've been using. Right now, that's at about 11 million, and that will get us to June, to the end of the school year. So we have coverage. If the bond doesn't pass, that'll be a conversation I have with our Michelle Morrison, our new CFO. But this isn't it has to happen. I mean, we're in a desperate situation. This is the heart, if you will, of our school system. Does all of our business, accounting, payroll, and the system that we're on is literally being held together by a shoestring. It is very cumbersome, a lot of manual processes for HR, for finance. And so it's critical. And it's going to take us still 2 years once, we signed the bond, it gets approved by our taxpayers, and they say yes, it's still going to take us 2+ years before we are implemented and are able to run our first payroll. So there's quite a bit of work. But to answer your question, Mi Young has assured us that there are bridge funds in the event that the bond doesn't pass.
25 years is a really long time to run an ERP. That my background is tech. Don brought me on because of that. One other question with that business modernization ERP, because we kind of talked about it in curriculum. Does that include, or is there funding included for all the people change management? Because this will be like a really significant shift.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious, like if that's included as well.
Yeah, wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. Currently, we have our change manager on board, as well as our program manager, and there are 18 positions sprinkled throughout. So in finance, in IT, in HR. What we are currently doing is taking subject matter experts like Kathleen in payroll. She's a subject matter expert dedicated now to the bond, and we've backfilled her in payroll. And so the bond is paying for that backfill to keep the day-to-day activities and operations going while we need her expertise to build and design the new system.
And then
And
I have
so,
one.
if I could, so the goal is that these are temporary, folks, with temporary being multi-year. Those positions will be phased out through attrition um, as we implement the tool. We'll be working with Michelle Morrison because following what the county did, Multnomah specifically, and they implemented a little over 2 years ago, there are some folks that we will need to keep on full time and they will transition to general fund.
A great answer. And then I promise this is my last question because people are waiting outside the door for me to leave. The data center, and I realize that it's like all data center, classroom tech infrastructure. Was there an analysis done of like on-prem versus off-prem? And I'm sure the answer to that is yes. And I know that like off-prem is often thought of as kind of the saving grace, but then as you scale, those costs can become equally high. So like, did you all do like, what did that kind of look like for keeping it on site versus off site when you like factor in like the HVAC and the energy sustainability associated with that?
No, that's a great question. So when we say data center upgrades, it's not so much the data center at the PEC, it's the closets, IDFs and MDFs at all the schools. Those have to exist, even though all the software and platforms are in the cloud. You have to have that so that you can connect to the internet that runs the wireless access. So
Perfect.
our
Thank you.
footprint is pretty small in the data center in comparison to most organizations. We have taken, thanks to Don and leaders before him, have tried to get as much into the cloud, and we will continue to do so to reduce our carbon footprint.
Awesome. Thank you. Great answers. I'm sorry I have to drop. Greg, you're now in charge.
Thanks for the questions. Anyone else?
Yeah, real quick, I guess, Derek, looking at the 176 million over the 8 years, is this the minimum need to meet these goals or the maximum or in the range of things? Where might this fall?
Norm, that's a great question. It is the minimum. We reduced this, have to get my calculator out, but we were at, I think, 222 million originally, and we reduced this following what Joanna mentioned. Dr. Armstrong came back and challenged us to right size this to make sure that what we were doing showed up in the building and not by the bond. This does not get us where we need to be. For example, every school has large AV equipment in their large spaces, ranging $50,000 to $100,000. We have to ask ourselves the question, building principals and leaders. And I just spoke with John Ferraro at Jackson last week. They had their annual winter choral event, and they borrowed from Tim at the PEC this mobile unit to have a sound system so that the families that came in for this particular event could hear, because their sound system doesn't work. These systems are a decade plus old. They're beyond repair, and there is no budget to replace them. So we put them in when we build the buildings, but there's no sustainability. So there's going to be some conversations and recalibrating with Michelle Morrison when she's on board. I'll be working with Dan. We really have to come up with a plan to either say we're going to sunset these devices and no longer support them, which I don't think is the right plan. Schools need these sound systems for all of their events, for community, for choir. The question is what does that look like? And let's right size them and get a company in here to do an assessment. But that is not funded, and that has not been shared with our administrators. That's going to be nor is an ongoing repair budget for the ones that are in service. So there are some things that are outlined in detail of what this will not pay for. By bond or general fund.
So, for our purposes of this meeting, we just, I guess the question is 176 million. I don't know, some of this is probably spend up too. You can it could vary somewhat, even though it's minimal, but this is adequate.
Yes,
This is
the
dollars.
easy answer is yes. Everything that we have outlined, we can deliver on. At least in the first 4 years, 5 through 8. We don't know what technology is going to look like. We'll be partnering with Joanna and Christina in teaching and learning and see what the new technology is to meet the needs of teachers and staff. But based on what we know today and crystal balling what we've done in the past, yes, this definitely meets those needs.
Great, thank you. Dan, how are we doing on time here? We're getting kind of
Was this supposed to be an hour?
Hour and a
half.
half.
Okay, then.
So
Yeah.
now,
24 minutes.
okay, we'll pick up speed. Still answer questions. Thank you, Derek. We're going to go into modernizations, and bear with me for a minute. This needs a little bit of context. The approach on modernizations has changed. Our high school modernization projects go through several phases, including a pre-design phase we call comprehensive planning. And comprehensive planning is when the project team, including our design team, our project managers, our third-party cost estimators, et cetera, essentially combine PPS's program requirements, which we call our education specifications, other documents, but that's the big one that says 1,700 students, these are the teaching stations, et cetera. Combining that with existing site conditions and constraints, unique school programs, stakeholder input into one cohesive plan, project schedule, and budget. And then these comprehensive plans for each school, including scope, schedule, budget, are approved by the board, and that is what moves our projects into schematic design. I think that's old hat for a lot of folks, but I think it's helpful context. In our meeting in May with this group, when we did our initial bond planning meeting, we reviewed each one of those high school modernization project cost estimates and that methodology to get there, which is shown here, and that's based on the comprehensive plan. And that is still, I'll call it current, for lack of a better word at the moment. This is going to make sense in a minute, I hope or promise. The team, OSM, has been charged recently to take a new look at these high school designs, all three, Cleveland, IW Wells, and Jefferson, and to propose options to reduce those projects. And so I'm going to do my best to walk through this. So that first column there, we're under project budgets. That is what the total of the project budgets are under the comprehensive plan we call the current plan. The teams have been directed to look at redesigning, updating these projects to meet the project budget targets that are that middle column under budgets, target project budgets. The delta between these two categories is $329 million. Here's where it might get a little confusing, but we'll try to walk through it. All three projects are split funded between the 2020 bond and then the proposed upcoming bond. So that bottom table there identifies how much the 2020 bond has contributed to the modernization projects. And the other column is the amount the 2025 bond will contribute to the projects based on the target budget. So the total budget for the three high schools at the target budget in the 2025 bond is $680 million, with $348 million for Cleveland and for Wells. The funding for the category modernization is $1.15 billion. So it's a delta of $470 million. And there, where you see the other row at that bottom of the funding, that's where you see that $470 million. The intent is that these projects will be redesigned to meet that target budget. This delta of $470 million will then be spent on future unidentified modernization projects, elementary schools, and middle schools. However, if those projects, one or more, do not meet their target budgets, then that 470 is available to refund, for lack of a better term, those projects. So to try to put a finer point and close this out for questions is the bond proposal commits to completing the three projects and has a target of funding them to $680 million, but there's over 1.1 billion to actually complete that work, effectively creating a very large contingency. I know that's very confusing. Does that make some sense?
It makes sense, but gotta be honest, we had the 366 for the Jefferson project and we couldn't do it once we got out and met with the community. So, and the Cleveland and Ida B. Wells went through this big community process, and everybody thought they're going to get swimming pool and all that stuff. So can you tell me how are we going to put cheaper light bulbs in or something? How are we going to get down to 3? It's one thing to say that's the number. It's another thing to actually be able to do it.
Yes.
I think I had the same question, and I can rephrase it a little differently. The way I was thinking of it is, are the project teams, have they expressed any confidence on how they can reduce each project by 20 to 25%?
Those are great questions. And as you are familiar with the process in which produces our designs and our cost estimates, we are undertaking a process to look at how we might reduce those costs. And I'll let Stormy, if you don't mind, Stormy, being put on the hot seat, give just a quick overview of what that process looks like.
Sure. So a couple of weeks ago, we directed our design teams to pause on the 3 modernization project designs. And we have led them into a cost savings study. So this is not us in OSM making decisions, but this is us studying changes in the design that would result in lower costs for these buildings. They're in the process of doing that right now. And each of the 3 projects, the design teams are required to study the cost savings associated with a list of specific design changes, because the requirements for the high schools are essentially the same. Some of them have different characteristics as far as what needs to be done for the site work, for athletic fields, and for demolition. But the new building part, those requirements are essentially the same, which has led them to being very designs with similar characteristics. So there's we keep calling it kind of a menu of items, but there is a list of specific design changes that each project team is studying right now to let us know, if we go down to kind of the minimum requirements and the ed spec, just what is required in our educational specification for a comprehensive high school. What is that kind of base cost level? And then if we take out other requirements that are more higher performing than code minimum requirements for seismic and for energy use and for our climate policy here at PPS, what would the cost difference be for that? So that doesn't get us down to this target budget though. So each team is then saying, okay, what kind of building do you get and what capacity would you get if we were to meet that target? So all of that will be gathered into a report and shared with the superintendent and with the board as inputs into their decision-making processes on which of these cost-saving measures that they are ready and willing to accept or not.
But I guess the problem for our committee is you want us to sign off on that this is enough, and we have absolutely no idea. We knew it wasn't enough before. We lost a year or two with Jefferson, so we had inflation. Then we had some policy things. All the things that we could have done 366 had we stuck to it. And the issue of the 1,700 students that we have to provide for, even though it seems kind of large for Jefferson with 500 kids. I guess, I don't know about the rest of the committee, but I don't know how we can help you, Dan, at this point of the game when we don't, and Stormy, when we don't know what those trade-offs are. We can't tell the board, I don't see how we can do it. So help me.
What the board and what the superintendent are committing to is that the total amount of these funds are available for these high school modernizations. So the total amount does cover the amounts that are in the comprehensive plans that the board reviewed and approved already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, there was the article in the Oregonian about a week ago or so saying that these would be the most expensive high schools in the country, and managing the politics of that as, you know, as we're going back to the voters, even if the tax rate would stay the same. And I will be really curious to know what comes out of that work that you've tasked the design team and perhaps your CMGCs with, because I don't have any kind of grasp on the extent to which these numbers that we see here in the column at the left about the current project budgets, how much above minimum spec, I don't want to say minimum spec, but the specs you're going. And I mean, I think I heard you say, or you're currently tracking towards, I think I heard you say that treating the specs as like the max you're going to do still isn't going to bring us down to the target budget. Did I hear that accurately?
So what I was referring to is our education specifications. So that is a document that describes all the spaces and the square footages and the characteristics of the building to provide a comprehensive high school facility.
Right.
And so within that, there are spaces that are required, there are spaces that are preferred, and there are spaces that are optional. And then on top of that, we take feedback from the community during our community engagement events, our design advisory groups, and our community design workshops. And we sometimes include customized areas within those buildings that would support programs that the individual high schools have that are unique to that high school community. So if we were to just remove the customized individual program spaces, the preferred and the optional spaces that we have in these current designs, that does not on its own get us down to the target budget.
Got it. Okay.
So I guess for Greg and Jonathan, and then Stormy and, you know, weigh in, but it sounds like we're not being asked to say, yeah, we can do these projects for 360 million or 366 million. We're being asked to say the project or the scope can be completed for more for the 469 to 455 to 491 million, because that's how much money is there.
Yes.
So I think it is,
Yeah, that's
if
fair.
this cost reduction gets 5% out of each of these, we're still enough money. But I guess, you know, there's, like Greg said, there's, you know, or Jonathan, we don't have any idea from those the current budgets to the target budgets where that might fall, and you won't know either, I guess, until they go through the cost reduction process. Which how long is that going to take? The studies.
Probably it'll be after, you know, before they will refer this bond measure in January, and that will be before we have a solid understanding of the decisions that'll be made around these cost reductions.
So I guess in one sense, I feel comfortable that with the cost reduction measures being actively pursued, that we should be able to come in under the 1,415,000,000. I don't know if anyone there's no confidence in anybody to get to the 1,086,000,000, I think. So somewhere in between works, and hopefully it's on the lower end rather than the higher end, thus having funding for the other middle schools and whatnot.
I mean, we were okay as a group with the current project budget. We went through that, and we don't make the political decision whether they're the most expensive or the cheapest high schools in the country. Based on what you gave us, we thought you could build those high schools for that amount of money. And it goes without saying that even on the past projects, you've always found savings as you work through value engineering every project. You've found money that you've been able to apply to other projects. I think what's a little troubling this time is that the public pronouncement that the school board made that said these are what these projects are going to cost. And so looking at it from this bond accountability committee, we're still with the current project budget until we can see some reason that it would be different. And we understand that you'll value engineer a bunch of things out of it that'll make it be less expensive at the end of the day. And I think we'd all agree that that's probably possible, but we have no idea how much that will be.
Now, like Norm, I'll just second what he said. I mean, I'm comfortable with the overall budgets. I understand the approach, the reasons for it. Stormy, I do have one maybe overly specific question, but I am curious about the seismic performance of these buildings and whether that educational specification, whether there's a certain level of seismic performance that is a base spec, or whether there are choices that you get to make about how well these buildings will come through, the Cascadia subduction earthquake.
Heidi, can you speak to that? I don't think there are requirements in the ed spec in particular about seismic performance.
No, this is my understanding of the history of this part of the design discussion. So the baseline code compliant approach would be to engineer these buildings to seismic risk category 3. There was direction provided, and I believe it applied to all the 2017 bond projects, to build a portion of the school, and I don't know on 2012, so Dan will know that one, to build a portion of the school to seismic risk category 4. And the intent was for that portion of the building, usually it's like the gym and some other stuff, that will serve as an emergency shelter or operations site of some kind. The resiliency measures more recently adopted by the code included looking at the entire structure for each high school to be built to risk category 4. The intent was to shorten the amount of time to occupation after a large event. I think that we still don't know. There's other details to get into. I could talk about seismic stuff all day, but I think that we don't necessarily, it's an untested direction. So we're just discovering the expense in it and the related scope items. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
There was a previous member of our committee who was a real advocate for the seismic zone 4. He actually serves on a statewide committee. He's pushing legislation, and you know who I'm talking about, Heidi. And he's not on the committee anymore, but he was a big advocate for it, trying to bring in state legislation that would require schools to be at the number 4 category, given their prominence in the community.
Yeah, I think just for the record, since this meeting is being documented in detail through recording, I want to acknowledge that to date, it's not typical for other institutions that I've worked on in the state that might be built to seismic risk category 4 that we harden all interior elements and utilities. So the non-structural requirements have not necessarily been in parity with the superstructure requirements. And so that is a topic for us to get into at some point if we want to move further in that direction. But right now, the code does not require it.
Okay, 2 more categories. I'll go through them very quickly. I'll basically just read my notes, and so I'll speed read them. So I'll try to make it as least little awkward as possible. So program contingency and then program administration. So program administration, this group knows is the resources necessary to manage the bond projects. And so just some examples of what those expenses include is staff, both staff that are in the Office of Modernization, but we also fund staff that live in other departments like finance, for example, who effectively work exclusively on bond projects or bond work. The bond is a very large portion of the overall district finances and operations. Admin also includes consultants such as our project construction management team members, but also especially consultants like cost estimating when we need it, facility assessments, legal services. Our bond performance auditors expenses come from the admin line. Bond issuance costs, when we sell our tranches of bonds, those have very significant costs, many millions of dollars. Those are paid for by admin, as is our owner-controlled insurance program. Typically, our process for estimating our admin is during planning, early planning, we just estimate a percentage. And that way, as we're doing lots of different iterations of bond scope, that we just have a percentage that's calculating that amount. And we know that generally, and depending on what the scope is of a bond, that impacts the administration, of course. So estimating admin is a lagging effort compared to the scope that goes into the bond. And we know generally larger projects have a lower percentage burden. Few people managing really large projects, very expensive projects, whereas smaller projects have a higher burden percentage. To support multiple bond options during this planning effort, we do this just apply a percentage. But once the scope is set, we develop a unique staffing and admin plan specific to each bond scope of work, each bond project. This 2025 bond is unique in that the scope of the work is less detailed than in previous bonds, like in 2017 or 2020, making it not overly practical to develop an accurate staffing plan, such as if these high schools come in significantly under, if we are able to reduce these costs, we're going to have a number of extra projects. How many of those are, we don't know. So it's really hard to plan for that. So as noted, I think in the staff report, our 2020 bond admin budget was 6% of the total value. We're currently tracking at a little less than that 6% in our expenses, and we think we're going to complete a little under that 6%, which is $62 million. So what we've done, instead of a specific staffing plan and estimating that, we are recommending a budget of 5% or $83 million for the 2025 bond, giving some flexibility there just with the unknowns. It's worth noting that these expenses are effectively time and materials. So if actual spending is less, which we have seen in previous bonds, that savings goes to the program contingency, which ultimately gets spent on bond projects. So any question on administration? I don't see any. So I'll jump to contingency. As we know, program contingency is a risk management tool used to buffer against unanticipated costs. Also, it's available for discretionary scope increases. This proposed option has a 5% program contingency at $83 billion. Typically, we would like to see a contingency at 10% or higher. But again, program contingency is really dependent upon what that scope of work is. And considering the majority of the funding, the proposed plan is allocated to the modernizations we just talked about, so that $1.15 billion. And the goal is to complete those projects for more than $400 million less than that. That strategy, and I'll just add this too, I think, very good discussion about the modernizations and the uncertainty of where they're going to land. I think something that I've observed is leadership and the board's desire to reduce those costs, including making hard decisions to reduce those costs, even if that includes cutting scope. That's yet to be seen. We haven't presented them with anything, so we can't forecast that. But I am observing a pretty strong desire to reduce overall costs. And if those costs are reduced, and if we get anywhere near that target budget, we effectively have this very large contingency that is dedicated to the modernization projects, reducing the need to have additional contingency on top of it. The remaining budget, $109 million, is for our facility improvements, deferred maintenance, which is effectively a spend up. As we talked about, curriculum budget represents effectively an annual allocation that is supported by other non-bond resources. So neither of those scopes should need significant additional contingency. And that leaves the remaining work, including athletics, technology, PE, and our admin costs, about $350 million. So we believe that $83 million for that work, plus the additional work, we think is adequate program risk management. A few worthwhile notes about contingency. We traditionally supplement our program contingency, PPS, with any bond sales, additional revenue. Bond sale premium and interest earnings are common. So when we sell those bonds, they have fees, yes, but also if they sell for a premium, we get that premium gets added to the bond, the program contingency. That's not a guarantee. That depends on the market, lots of other things. That said, historically, we have seen for all of our bonds, we've seen significant sales premium to the tune of tens of millions of dollars for each tranche that is sold. We also have seen when we receive those funds, we invest those funds, and those have annual interest revenue. Those also increase the program contingency. Again, those aren't guaranteed, therefore we don't forecast them. We just, we're aware that there's a good chance that we will receive those. PBS has also applied for the Oregon School Capital Improvement Matching Program. If we are awarded this, that will be an additional $12 million that will also go into the program. And just all program contingency funds are ultimately allocated and spent on bond projects and bond eligible costs. So in totality, we feel that the scope of the work with the estimating methodology, with the risk management tools that we as staff believe is reasonable, that the scope will be able to be achieved with the budget that is allocated. So that is the end. Now we're on to questions and next steps.
Okay, we have any questions? Further questions? I got to say, Dan, the work you and the team have done at PPS is, this is really complicated stuff, and there's a lot of balls in the air, and to me, it would be overwhelming what you have to do. So I got to give you thanks, Ian. It's hard. So I think you guys done a great job.
I appreciate it's definitely a team effort. I actually do very, very little. So I'm appreciative of everyone who's on this call and so many people who are not on this call. Jonathan, I saw your hand raised.
No, it wasn't a hand. No, it was the thumbs up emoji.
Oh.
I second what Craig says. It's really impressive what you all do, and very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, if we have no more questions, Dan wants a recommendation. And we've kind of talked about it as we went through.
So the expectation is that the committee puts together a written recommendation.
Right.
I'm happy after this to reach out to BC members and just follow up. Is there any other follow up? And do you have any questions or about how to craft that? And I'm happy to help do that or provide suggestions or advice or whatever.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. What I have now is that we know the curriculum covers about 75%, and the other 25 is to come from other sources if needed, right? That's one. And based on what we've heard and based on what we've heard from the staff, you believe that you can cover what needs to be done in that amount, both those. We've heard from technology that you will meet the needs you have, but there are other needs that you have. But in terms of the bond, the amount of money that you're proposing will cover the minimum, he called it the minimum needs to make your IT technology, to make your technology successful in the district. What I heard from the 3 project designs is that while we have $1.15 billion would be available, the goal is to reduce that number. But the committee at this point in time thinks you might be able to do something, but we still are comfortable with the current budget. That's what we know. We don't know anything else. So if you can reduce it, that's great. But fact is, based on what you've told us before, it's going to take $1.15 billion to build those 3 high schools under the current scope of work that you have. Until you reduce it, that's what we got. Committee members, did I misstate something? Am I wrong?
Sounded good to me.
You, Craig.
Yeah, what I can do is write that, send it to you. I'm happy to let you go ahead and tweak it a little bit to make it correct, and we can then send it out to the rest of the committee if that's allowable, and we can look at it.
Yeah, happy to provide any comments and then allow you to take them or leave them.
Okay, we can't meet as a group, so I can take a response from you individually and then we can put that together.
Do you mind if
And
I add just one tiny comment on the curriculum?
Yes.
Jan and Greg,
Mhm.
just to note that the 75% is of the new schedule. So
Oh.
it's a new model. Okay, great. Thank you.
No, I didn't know that. So thank you for telling me that.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
the new schedule. You're right, because the first time around, you had to start from scratch, basically, given
Mhm.
how long it'd been since you were using textbooks that Norm and I had when we were in the Portland Public Schools 50 years ago. So, okay.
Thank you.
All right. I'll work on that tomorrow, Dan. Send it over to you. Do you the
Great.
one you want me to send it to?
You can just send it to me. That's fine. I'll be
Okay.
your single point of contact.
Okay. Anything else for the good of our group? All right. Oh, by the way, so the school board is going to hear this on January the 7th, and they're going to intend to make the referral. So if any of you, I'm sure you can watch it on YouTube. That's what I did last night, watching the bond discussion. Or you can, I guess, show up in person and listen to it as well. So that's January 7th. Okay, hearing nothing else. Happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you at our next meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Happy holidays.